Hey, what's up guys? Nick Quintero here, and today I'm going to show you how I made a realistic looking Photoshop image using one of my newest fonts. All right, let's go. All right, so I took this stock image of this water tower and I started to erase the text that was on it. So first I made a duplicate layer in case I needed to come back to the original. I wouldn't lose all of my original image. So I started by using the rectangle selection and using content aware erase, but it was giving me a little bit of trouble. So I went ahead and tried the second letter and it was doing the same thing where it was only erasing part of it, which was super annoying. So I decided that this wasn't going to work and I moved on to these smaller pieces of text at the bottom and it was working a lot better. So I went ahead and finished all of that using that method of the rectangle selection and content aware. So now I tried it again on the R because I'm stubborn and it did not work. So I decided to switch to the healing brush. So now with the healing brush, I actually just painted right over these red letters and it seemed to work a lot better. So I went ahead and finished this whole part of the job with the healing brush. Cleaned up a couple of extra spots here and moved on to the next part. So now I grabbed my text tool and I typed out the word Bernie, which is the name of the font that I just made that I was making this image for. So I selected my Bernie font from my font list and I went ahead and blew it up to the size that I needed it. Then I used the warp tool and I changed it from arc to arch because it doesn't give the bends on the left and right side and it just goes up and down. So then I adjusted the angle of that arch warp so that it fit the shape of the water tower as close as I could. Made it a little bit bigger and committed that action. So now I went back to my original image so that I could reference the red color of the text because that's what I want to make my text. So I went ahead and filled in my text layer and then I played around with some layer styles to see if I could get something that looked kind of close to the original image. Multiply wasn't really working because it was making the color basically just dark gray. So I went ahead and chose darken for now and I lowered the opacity down to about 82. I duplicated my text layer and then I made the second layer of text and made it a little bit smaller to kind of replicate the layout of the original image. So once I had all of that together, I flattened those two layers together so that I could mess with the transparency and layer style a little bit more. And I decided to land on overlay. I adjusted my sliders on my levels just to see if I could get it a little bit closer to the original image. And I realized I had to bump my saturation up a little bit before I could really make these things look right. So I added another layer on top of my text layer and I clipped it to the layer below it. Then I chose a soft opacity like pressure brush and started painting in some details that gives the artwork like two layers of color so that it looks like paintbrush strokes. This is how I draw over text like this to give it like a really realistic or somewhat realistic hand painted look so that it looks like it's old and it's been faded. So basically I'll do two layers here where I paint on some dark details and then I will actually go back over it with another layer that is set to overlay and paint on some white details. So I usually just make sure that I'm varying the pressure that I'm drawing with and also varying the direction so that it's not all uniform and going one way and having the same amount of transparency. Creating any kind of variation like this by hand really helps sell the illusion that this is a real painted image that has just been faded out over time. You can see that with my brush strokes, I kind of do a lot of swiping and painting back over some of the same areas. So that way I can paint it a little bit lighter first and then darken it up as I go and as I need it to be darker. I stick to doing the dark parts on the outlines of the letters I don't know why, but to me, it just makes it feel like it's got, more of a realistic look that way. So lower the opacity a little bit so that there's less contrast between the dark layer and the medium layer. And this is where I set it to overlay, and you can see how it makes it a little bit more subtle. So painting with white on a layer that's set to overlay can really be an easy way to get some simple highlights or just some brighter variation of the color that you're painting over. So the way I have it set up right now, the bottom layer is the medium color, like the red or maroon, and the two layers stacked above it are actually just painted with straight black and straight white, just set to overlay with the transparency adjusted. So now I'm going to repeat this drawing process on the Texas layer. You can see I kind of started by eye dropping the darker red to paint over, but really this would work with that color or the black. I usually prefer to use the black here, but I had my eyedropper handy, so I just went for it. Now I'm going to switch to doing the highlights. You can see I draw the highlights more inside the text layer than I did the dark parts. So now I grouped these layers together, and then I actually went ahead and duplicated it and flattened it because I was trying to convert it to a smart object so that I could mess with the layer styles a little bit more. But the transparency and things that I was trying to apply to it weren't looking exactly how I wanted just yet. And you can see I had a little freak out there. So I went ahead and added noise to this smart object layer, and I lowered it down pretty low, below 1% at this point, but I end up bumping up a little bit more. So now I'm also going to go ahead and add a Gaussian blur to this smart object as well. And I'm going to keep that pretty low because I don't want it to be blurry. I just don't want it to be too sharp when you see it on top of the image behind it that is not perfectly sharp either. So it just kind of helps sell the realism whenever your added elements have a little bit of blur to match the blur that's in your original photo. So now I'm going to go ahead and take this into Liquify, and I'm going to use the default brush here, the one that like pushes and pulls things around, and I'm going to take my brush size pretty low, and I'm just going to paint around the edges to give this some texture to make it look like it was made by hand and a little bit more natural to the photo. Anything that you can do to decrease the crispness of your added graphic is really going to help you out here. So I achieved this natural look by kind of pushing and pulling in opposite directions back and forth. So I'm actually just doing a lot of tapping, and I'm using my Wacom Cintiq pen here, so that way I can actually just tap and draw like right over these things. It makes it a lot faster, and it's super helpful to get it to look like a natural variation. You could do this with a mouse as well, but I have my Wacom Cintiq, so it just makes sense to just draw right over it when it's on this step. It's a lot easier to do the push and pulls on these smaller letters because a little bit goes a long way. All right, click OK to go back to my image, and it's very subtle, but you can see the difference here. And now I can really fine tune my noise and my blur that's on my smart object. I scaled my image up just a little bit because I really wanted that D to be over that rough dark area on the left, and that S to be over that like weird drippy layer on the bottom right. So I'm just adjusting how my blur looks just visually. It's just a lot easier rather than worry about what the numbers are. You can actually just pay attention to what's changing while you're shifting the amount. You just want just enough blur so that your added text matches the background as well as possible. So now I'm going to click Command and click on the thumbnail of my added font. Then I'm going to use that selection to duplicate a part of the original image and move that layer to the top. So now I clip that layer to my text, and I'm going to change that layer style to lighten. Actually, I don't know if lighten is what I chose. I should pay more attention to my own video. But I feel like lighten is where I went. Or maybe I went to overlay. Screen. Look at that. All right, so now I adjusted my levels so that way that image that I'm using to create some texture on top of the text, I can control the contrast and really see what is showing through and what's not. So when I get it to the point that I like it, I click OK. I'm duplicating both of these layers because I want to flatten them together and then change that whole layer style to overlay. Lower my saturation a little bit to get us back down to that original red. You'll remember I bumped it up a little bit earlier so I could see it, but you know, in the end, it's a little bit more brown, a little bit more orange, and that's really what gives you that realistic tone, because those faded letters, you know, they're not going to be like 100% red at this point. So I added another layer on top and changed it to overlay, and I turned the opacity way down. It's very subtle, but to me, it really helped with the realism of getting it just a little bit brighter. And then I messed with my levels one more time on that top layer with it zoomed out just so I can see what the final result is. All right, guys, that's it for this one. Thank you so much for checking out this video. I hope it helps give a little bit of insight on how to make some realism in Photoshop when dealing with text on existing photos. If this is your first time checking out one of my videos, I do a lot of tutorials like this for Photoshop and Illustrator. A lot of them are focused on creating t-shirts and merch for your small businesses, brands, bands, whatever it is. So if you're getting value from these videos, please consider subscribing. It helps me out tremendously. And also, if you hit that little bell notification, you will be notified every time I release a new video like this so you don't miss out. Also, of course, hitting that like button helps out as well. It tells YouTube this is a good video, and then it starts to show it to more people who it thinks can get value from this. I appreciate you guys checking these out. I really enjoy doing this, so I hope you guys enjoy watching them. And like always, we'll catch you on the next one. Later.